And coming up on today's show, are 147 years of UK manufacturing of trains about to come to an end in Derby? The Jacobite steam train dispute rumbles on, and indeed gets a bit worse. Is Labour about to do a U-turn on bringing the railways back into public ownership? And, in some good news, a new £17.5 million rail terminal opens at Southampton. Hello, and welcome to Green Signals, your railway podcast. From me, Nigel Harris, in a very drab Lincolnshire this morning, and from
me, Richard Bowker, and it has to be said, an equally dreary-looking Wiltshire.
Dreich, as they say in Edinburgh, isn't it?
They do indeed, and it applies here perfectly today.
Isn't that a good word? It sounds like what it is.
It absolutely is. It does. It is. Hang on. I'm not even sure I've got the speech module in this morning. Anyway, more coffee. All right.
We'll just plough on. Plough on.
Keep going.
We're nearly at the end, aren't we? Oh, goodness. Okay, right. Be serious. We're always really grateful for your amazing support as Green Signals grows. And we had a particularly very humbling and pleasant message this week, which I just want to share with you because it really touched all three of us. From Andrew Turtle 7231, who says, "You're a great pair of presenters with a brilliant dynamic between you both." Did we just show that? Your channel is informative and knowledgeable, so please, capital letters, do keep up the good work. We will, Andrew, and thank you for your kind words. They do mean a lot to both of us, don't they?
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you, Andrew.
We were literally blown away by the reaction to last week's episode, where we looked in particular at the Jacobite steam train and the ongoing dispute over central door locking. Last week's episode became our first podcast video, I know you like those, to exceed 10,000 views, and it's still being watched and is certain to climb higher in terms of numbers of views. It also enabled us to add stacks of new subscribers. Having achieved 1,000 YouTube subscribers in 3 months, the YouTube average is about 22 months for that, just 2 months later, we flew through 2,000 over Easter. And that's all down to you, and we're humbled. Thank you. Thanks so much, and if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button too, or follow us if you're listening on Spotify. Now, I mentioned the Jacobite steam train in the intro. Do update us on what you've discovered, Richard.
Well, there have been some developments. I tell you what, before we talk about those, it's just worth going back to what you've just said about the views and subscribers growth of the last episode. Because what came with that was the most extraordinary number of comments.
Which you tend to handle.
Yeah, well, I was just a bit overwhelmed. And with Easter coming in as well, it was a bit sort of crazy. I mean, I think we've had about 500 likes, over 500 likes on that episode, and stacks of comments. Now, what's interesting about them is they're quite polarized. So there are people who believe that the ORR are doing absolutely the right thing. And there are people who believe that it's all a bit ridiculous and it's health and safety gone mad. And
common sense.
I'm paraphrasing. Absolutely right. So it is quite polarized. And that's not entirely surprising. I mean, there's some other comments sort of in the middle somewhere as well. And there's quite a few questions. So please, if you've asked a question, we're going to do our really best to get back to you, but we've just not managed to do yet. But we will do. What's interesting about it and what has changed is, or it's been a development, I suppose, is that West Coast Railways have put something up on their website which talks about why there is a dispute, because I think now they've extended the period that ticket sales have been suspended for by another week, perhaps. So they've put something on their website, which I've actually got here. I just need to reach over and find it. And on that, they've made a number of comments. Now, look, it's very important. We're just sort of reporting what's going on here.
We're holding up a mirror, is what I always used to say.
We are holding up a mirror indeed. That's a good expression. But some of the things that they said in here are quite interesting. So, for instance, they say other companies are operating on the mainline rail network using the same Mark 1 and Mark 2 carriages that West Coast Railways use without having CDL fitted. The ORR has allowed them to continue to run under an exemption granted by the ORR, even though these carriages have not been fitted with CDL. West Coast Railways has not been granted the same exemption as these other operators. Now, this is interesting. They say, as this policy is deemed to be about safety, it is clear from the above that there is no short-term safety issue with the carriages. Otherwise, no operator would be allowed to run these carriages without having CDL fitted. Now, it's very, we haven't heard what the ORR's view of that is. Maybe they haven't expressed one. Maybe they're just looking at the exemption that's been applied for. I must admit, when I read the judicial review judgment, which we talked about on the show last week,
we did.
I don't read it in quite the same way as it's just been described there. But as I say, everybody's entitled to their own view. So we'll just have to wait and see what the ORR do or say. So just bear with us if you've asked loads of questions, because we're going to come back to this next week, no doubt.
Indeed, and maybe I'm insufficiently caffeinated, but I'm just trying to think which Mark 1s are running on the main line which don't have CDL.
I think it's more a question of whether or not there is a plan to fit CDL or not in the future, or whether there is an existing exemption. Don't know what the situation is with the North Yorks Moors Railway, who operate Mark 1s to Whitby from Gromont. And again, that's a comment that was raised by somebody. Another good question, by the way, was, well, hang on a minute, you talked about windows. What's that got to do with central door locking? And of course, it's a kind of separate issue. Of course it is. I again understand that LSL, with their Saphos trains fleet of Mark 1s, have fitted a diagonal bar across the inside of the window, which actually allows you to put your hand out to open the door.
But you can't.
It doesn't allow you to put your head out. It doesn't look very nice, although it's on the inside, so it doesn't affect the external appearance. So there's lots to this. It's not particularly, it's not a binary issue, and we need to look at it a bit more. The only thing I think we can say with some certainty is that the ORR's position so far, in terms of exemptions for mainline operation, has been pretty clear.
And much more to come on that. Okay, more to follow soon. On with the news. Train building has been a feature of the Derby landscape since the Midland Railway days in 1847. In the 1980s, it was Brell, British Rail Engineering Limited. Then, with privatisation of Brell, we successively had ABB, Adtrans, Bombardier, and finally Alstom. But for the workers in Derby, train building, at least, and of course refurbishment, has thus far, been a constant. However, in December last year, when giving evidence to the Transport Select Committee, Alstom UK's and Ireland MD Nick Crossfield said that if orders were not forthcoming, then the plant would have to be mothballed. Just as a bit of an aside, I have to say that Derby has been shroud waving like this for a very long time. Throughout my 28 years on rail, we had this every few years from Derby. If we don't get some orders, we'll shut it down. And I might remind her of the young boy who was always crying wolf. Now it looks like the firm is making good on its threat. It's a bitter blow for the city and humiliating in the extreme for the government, because Derby's planned to be the home of GBR, having won the competition, which increasingly it looks like having no real prize. Richard, TfL need new trains. Other TOCs need new trains. Why don't the government simply place some orders and keep the plant going? We're going to need those trains anyway.
It's a very fair question. I mean, why don't they just do that? I think to understand this, one has to look at this. I think there's three big issues, and they are boom and bust, if you like, peaks and troughs, is sometimes called.
Feast and famine, call it
feast
what
and
you
famine.
want.
There we go. There's loads of them, aren't there? Right, brilliant. There's the question of the competitive and the changing competitive market, and then finally there's questions of lead times, which I think really goes to the heart of what you just said. If you start with the sort of feast and famine, peak and trough, whatever you want to call it, we had a big boom really in orders up to sort of 2018, 2019, that sort of period. I was just looking at the list of some of them. We had loads of stuff, Transport for Wales. We had all those Adventurer EMU, the EMU family that Alstom built, actually, which the last one has left Derby. We had, 750 vehicles for Southwestern Rail. We had a load for Greater Anglia, a load for West Midlands Trains. I must admit, thanks to Modern Railways, they do some excellent data compilation on this.
Yes, that's dear old Uncle Roger ploughs
it
away.
Is, and
produces some.
And an excellent piece by their editor Philip Sherritt, actually, in one of their recent editions. So we have to doff our cap to some real expertise here.
We give due acknowledgement to good work wherever we see it.
But we're talking hundreds of vehicles, and then there was obviously there's all the Hitachi stuff for East Midland Railways and Avanti. Now all the Alstom stuff's kind of done. The Hitachi stuff's still in the process of being done, but we're talking hundreds of vehicles. And I think what's happened is, if you go back, really this problem that we're talking about now in Derby really took place 5-6 years ago, when sort of franchise commitments were being made on the back of new trains. And arguably it affected long-term demand. It brought forward some of the forward demand and created a bit of a gap that we're seeing now.
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that. But
so it pulled it forward, right? And sort of filled the factories, or arguably overfilled the factories. So that boom and bust issue is a real issue. So that constant sort of cyclical nature of it.
So refurb it is then.
Well, there had been quite a lot of refurb. I mean, Alstom, I think, have got a place in Widnes, haven't they? Which has been really busy with refurb and still is. So, but it comes back to strategy, which talk about in a minute. And the second thing was a competitive market. It's got a bigger market, right? So when I was buying trains,
not many people get to say that, Richard.
No, that's fair. As my daughter says, in the olden days, Dad, and it was all black and white.
And then she picks a tape cassette up and says, "What's this?"
Yeah, words to that effect. We didn't have CAF, we didn't have Stadler in the UK market, now we didn't have Hitachi. So now we've got them. And so there's quite a lot of mouths to feed, if I can call it that.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the lead times issue, which is really back to the heart of why don't the government just place orders? And the problem is it just takes time. It takes time. Once you've decided you're going to buy a fleet of trains, it's sort of 3 years before you kind of see anything.
And isn't that the point, Richard? Even if the government did what Alstom are asking, it's not going to solve the problem short term. There's going to be 3 years before anything happens. So is it is it shroud waving? Is it leveraging off the GBR thing? What is it? Because even if the DFT said, yes, okay, here's an order, how's it going to help?
Well, today I don't think it would. And I think that's the real problem. This problem does go back to decisions that got taken, or whatever policy got put in place 5-6 years ago. This day was arguably always coming.
And Alstom must know that, though.
Well, I think everybody knows that. You'd like to think the DFT knew that as well.
Oh, God.
Yeah, in terms of strategy, really, if I can call it this, like in the good old days, and I'm almost talking pre-privatisation now, the strategy was you really invested in new trains in your highest income earners at the top.
Yeah.
And then it sort of filtered down. And you cascaded, and out the bottom dropped the oldest crap, if I can call it that.
Well, that's exactly. But you just said strategy.
Yeah, and that was the strategy.
But we haven't got one.
Well, we've had one of a sort, and the strategy has been you put your franchise bid in with new trains, you're more likely to win it. So, and it's pulled the orders forward. So we've ended up with a slightly different strategy. But I think we've actually got the problem with that strategy is it's very expensive and it creates this cyclical feast and famine, which not only doesn't help the train builders, but absolutely knackers the supply chain as well, because people have got to remember there's a massive supply chain supporting Alstom and Derby and supporting Hitachi and Newton Aycliffe and so on. So I think this is time for a rethink of the strategy. But I think that's medium to long term. I don't think it's going to help now. The short term at all.
I am also not convinced at all by Nick Crossfield's comment about mothballing Derby. When it's gone, it's gone. I remember when York Carriage Works closed and there was a lot of discussion about exactly this huge accumulation of carriage building expertise and skills over the decades at York. And you just can't get it back. So mothballing it, I just don't think is... I think it's sugarcoating it. You can keep the buildings.
Yeah, exactly. You can mothball a facility. I mean, we've slightly been here before. I mean, you'll know and remember Colin Walton well. Colin, for our regular listeners, he was the chairman of Bombardier in the UK for a while. I knew him when he was in a previous incarnation. He actually goes back to sort of the days of Procore, but you know, obviously Bombardier when it was up at Horbury in Wakefield. And Colin, during probably about 10 years ago now, they did do a fairly significant trimming of the workforce in Derby. And then when they got a load of orders, they brought some of them back. You know, actually grew about 400 jobs. So there is it does go up and down a little bit, but those core skills are very key. And what Nick Crossfield said to the Transport Select Committee in December last year, he said, look, at the moment, we're a kind of a full service factory. There are orders coming. I mean, there are a lot of orders coming, and we'll talk about, no doubt, Mark Harper and Louise Haig's sort of correspondence in the last week or so in a moment. But one thing Harper was right about is that there's quite a lot coming with, I mean, you look at Northern needs a whole load of new trains and replace all the sort of second generation DMUs. There's a load, the networkers south of the Thames need replacing. They're getting on a bit actually now. There's TransPennine got stuff coming. Yeah. There's Scotland's Railway. When we were talking to them recently, they're going to be ordering a load of stuff. So there are some big orders coming, you know, £3-4 billion worth. The problem is no one's actually placed those orders anymore and yet. And until they do, there's uncertainty. So I'm afraid this is a situation without an immediate solution.
Yeah, and Harper is saying, well, I'm going to say not to a degree, he is saying sort of, hang it out, chaps, there's jam tomorrow. You make an interesting point about Northern, Richard, because that's going to enter politics and climate change and everything, isn't it? Because there's no way you can replace a Northern fleet with batteries or hydrogen. So we are going to be having to be ordering new DMUs, aren't we?
Well, we could be looking at
hybrids, maybe.
Hybrids, yeah. So that needs a clear strategy. I think that's actually very close, if what I understand, in terms of being ready to sort of come to market, if it's not already actually. But there are some big orders coming, but they're just not coming. Yeah. They haven't come quick enough, and this was known about. That's the frustration. You know, there's been quite a few people saying for 3, 4, 5 years, this day was coming, right? And it was just, and it's just now come.
Well, it has. And to close on a final euphemism, which is my favourite, and don't worry, Richard, I won't say it out loud. My favourite euphemism, this, don't raise your eyebrows at me, is all or call. And we're in the all phase, aren't we?
Hard to know quite how to respond to that. So I shall be very straightforward. Look, it's very difficult if you're one of the folks working in at Derby's Litchurch Lane factory. This is the worst possible.
And I
news,
feel
really.
desperately for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, we all do. And, same goes for Hitachi up in the Northeast. They're just a little bit behind where Derby are. This is not good. And how awful it would be if the UK genuinely lost the ability to deliver a full service, sort of end-to-end
Yes.
train build capability. Because that bit, I agree, once that's gone, it isn't coming back. Trains in the UK will be built in the train orders for the UK will be fulfilled in the future. The question is, are they coming from Derby, or are they coming from Beijing? I don't know.
Spain or Switzerland or or wherever. Well, let's keep an eye on that one. And the words rolling stock strategy are good words to close on, because we desperately need a good one, I think.
Yeah.
On the subject of which, let us segue onwards with due elegance to the very strange exchange of correspondence, the strange reply, between Shadow Secretary of State Louise Haigh, who's making her presence felt more and more. That's going to be a good thing. And the actual Secretary of State, Mark Harper. Again, you've been digging into this in some detail, I think, Richard.
Well, this one wasn't hard because they both. So Louise published her letter to Mark Harper. So Mark Harper returned the favour and published his response to her. So the good news is we can see it all in black and white. It is quite interesting. Louise Haigh is absolutely entitled to say to the Secretary of State, what are you doing? What are you doing? Or more to the point, what have you not done? How have we ended up at this position? There's a little bit kind of political point scoring, but it's
her job. They're an opposition. They're there to oppose.
It's her job. Mark Harper is equally entitled to go, well, actually, I've got some facts and I'm a bit close to this. So you're wrong about this and you're wrong about that. I mean, and then that's the sort of the rough and tumble of all of this stuff. But Mark Harper's letter in response to Louise Haigh was quite fascinating, because it's quite long.
And just sum up in a sentence what Louise Haigh's letter was about, Richard. We haven't done that.
No. So she basically said, this is an absolute disaster for the UK rolling stock industry. It's in your gift to sort it out. You can't change what you haven't done in the last however, but you can do something now. You can vary some contracts. You can place some orders. They're your contracts, so you make the decision. And by the way, this is all part of the reason this has come about is because of HS2 and the fact you cancelled HS2 and all the rest of it. Right? So in other words, just pull your finger out basically,
extract your digit and get on with it.
Place some orders. Now, the one thing it's not about HS2. I mean, HS2 were never coming. Those weren't coming till 2026 anyway. And actually, that order's not changed. It might have to be amended in the light of the decision to cancel phase 2 A and B, right? But it's not that the 50 odd trains or whatever it is are still planned to be built,
because they might not need as many trains.
Well, they might need more if they go slower. Anyway, there's all sorts of stuff going on there, but it's not the reason we're in this pickle today. So, and he pointed that out. But what is fascinating, there's a tone of his letter which, if I were Louise Haigh, I would find quite grating, really.
Well, I thought it was patronising, if not condescending in places.
Yeah, well, and also one thing I thought was slightly misleading, and very careful to accuse a Secretary of State of Transport for misleading, but I'll read you one phrase, which is actually the second paragraph. In most cases, rolling stock procurements are carried out by train operators who lease their train fleets through rolling stock owning companies. Well, that's a matter of fact. Yeah, that's correct. Ministers don't buy trains directly, nor do we have the ability to directly vary contracts, as you have suggested. Now, the problem with that is what he's kind of saying is nothing to do with us, right? Really, we don't do this stuff. And why I say that's potentially misleading is because for the last 4 years, no train operating company has done anything. They haven't got out of bed without the Department for Transport sort of approving it and signing it off. And so that's naughty, right? The policy that's been put in place over certainly the last 4 years is absolutely an extension of it's the government pulling the strings. They might do it through the vehicle of someone else, but they're pulling the strings. Then he goes on page 2 to say the government is committed to a thriving UK rolling stock industry and seeks to ensure a regular flow of work for train manufacturing companies. It's almost like there's just sort of copy-paste statements here all over the place. He talks about the market for rolling stock is competitive and it's for manufacturers to manage capacity at their sites so they can bid effectively orders. Well, that's true, but again, it's almost like it's not really down to us. This was where I talk about tone. He says later on, train operators such as Avanti West Coast are subject to procurement law, and any contract or variation to a contract needs to follow the law. It's just not true that these can be changed, quote, at the stroke of a pen, as you have suggested. How about this? You know, or ought to know, that's simply not how public procurement law works. Your suggestion of simple solutions to complex issues is inaccurate and risks unrealistic expectations that are unfair to the workforce concerned. I mean, you know, or ought to know. I mean, little bit sort of
condescending,
talking down, yeah. But you read his letter. It's not wrong in the sense that there's not a lot that can be done in the short term. The one thing that did make me sort of really groan, and it really did make me groan.
Oh, Meldrew is on his way.
Well, no, you'll have a view on this. He said, our top priority is helping ensure that Alstom and Hitachi's workforces are properly supported. In the early autumn, I presume he means last year, I appointed a senior official to convene a cross-government task force to work with both companies and ensure government was properly prepared to help both companies through this difficult period. This task force meets regularly to ensure comprehensive government support. I mean, talk about shades of Sir Humphrey. I must admit, I used to attend the odd task force meeting on the odd thing. And I think the very first one I went to, I said, I am never going to that again, because that's 2 hours of my life I'm never going to get back. And I've convened a task force. Oh, good. Right.
Well,
when actually what we needed was a rolling stock strategy.
Somebody to do something. I was just going to make that point. As a long-term journalist, my heart sinks when I see the expression task force, which is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. It's an excuse for doing nothing but making it look like you have.
But otherwise, you think it's quite a good thing. Jeepers, right. Okay.
Yeah, no, but I mean, do you remember two things? Do you remember a few years ago, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, got into terrible trouble for addressing one of the female MPs in the House of Commons with the expression, calm down, dear. There's an element of that about this letter, I felt.
But I suppose it's a slightly depressing letter in the sense that it's not, you can't read any of it and go, well, that's just wrong. I think that first bit about it's not really up to us, it's up to the train operators.
And we can't directly vary contracts and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, again, the contract is probably not signed off by the Department of Transport, and it is subject to procurement law.
However,
but it's who is sat behind pulling the levers, and for the past 4 years, it's been the Department of Transport and it's been the government. And what's happening today is the consequence of decisions taken or not taken 4 or 5 years ago. The most sensible thing that I heard about all of this was actually back in December, when the same select committee, the one that where Nick Crossfield was talking about Alstom's predicament, was where David Clark of the Railway Industry Association said that in terms of the future, there are loads of orders coming. I mean, he was quite upbeat about that, but it's really important that we learn the lessons of the last few years and don't allow this cyclical issue, this boom and bust situation, to continue or happen again. It's no good for anybody. It'll merely create the same problem in a few years' time down the road. It's terrible for the supply industry. And he actually said, we've calculated we need about 600 vehicles per annum, including Transport for London orders for the tube. Let's get a plan that, as near as possible, delivers that sort of heartbeat of
Yeah.
flow.
And I think it would cost more in the long run not to do that. I mean, David's a good bloke. He talks a lot of sense on behalf of REA, and he's absolutely right there. And let's be honest, it's government's job to sort this, to take these decisions. I mean, we used to get it with Railtrack and Network Rail from the contracting industry saying, for God's sake, we know we're going to have to do this work. Just give us a pipeline of it so we can buy the heavy equipment, we can take on apprentices, we can keep the relevant staff. It's that same boom and bust argument. Why are we so pathetic at this?
I think part of the problem is because everybody thinks they're entitled to a new train, right? And possibly this comes down to a bit of a devolution, levelling up, regional thing. I don't know. But again, British Rail was quite savvy with this and put its new assets where they made the most amount of money for, and there was a cascade strategy. And yes, that did mean that sometimes if you lived in certain parts of the country, you were getting a cascaded, refurbished, older train. But that's not that's not a silly strategy. I think by saying that, everybody's entitled to a new train, it's partly led to where we are today.
And the thing is, a refurbished train, by the time it's been refurbished, it will have new seats, new vinyls, I'm talking about floors there, new trim inside. The bit that the passenger occupies is a new train, and it will smell of glue and paint and everything else when it first rolls out, and people tend to love them.
When I was at London Underground in the late 80s, early 90s, we refurbished the C stock, which was the stock that at the time went round the Circle Line and the Hammersmith and City Line.
Okay.
It's all been replaced now, obviously, by those rather lovely through gangwayed air-conditioned trains. But the C stock was refurbished late 80s, early 90s. And it was, I think, from memory, somebody will probably tell me I'm wrong, I think it was 67 stock. So it's quite old, right? And I remember Dennis Tunnicliffe, who was the MD of LU at the time, saying, it's amazing. I've got so many letters from people thanking us for these brand new trains.
Exactly.
And, I mean, I'm not saying you should try and con people, but as you say, refurbished trains can be really good.
But exactly the bit you sit in is new, so, and that's the important thing, You never hear anybody saying, I'm glad we got all these new bogies and motors. They say it's really comfortable, or the seats are comfortable, or not.
No, that is a phrase I've never heard, right?
What's
that? I love these new bogies and motors. Shall we move along?
I think you'll find.
Yeah.
Right. There was an interesting piece here's an expression I never thought I'd use either. There was an interesting piece in the Daily Mail on Monday last, which was reported on the BBC Today programme, which I stopped mid putting me socks on to listen to. I know. I thought I'd just.
Oh, excuse me. I just need to.
I thought I'd just share that with you. Me, sockless.
I wish you hadn't, but anyway, keep going.
Well, there you go. It's all part of the joy of green signals. The suggestion was that the Labour might be about to abandon its constantly voiced commitment to returning the railway to public ownership, because senior policymakers and senior figures in the party are said to be concerned about the potential cost. Now, the Mail also suggested that industry sources suggest it will cost more if brought back into public service. And sources close to Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, former Bank of England, very capable lady, last night refused to guarantee that the policy would even make it onto the party's manifesto at the general election this year. And as, we all know, transport generally and railways in particular are never feature in general elections. And we got the usual stuff about they won't be giving a running commentary on manifesto development, blah, blah, blah. It's a process. It's all subject to Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules and all that sort of thing. However, industry chiefs say that although there'd be likely to be some initial savings, in the long run, the policy would actually cost taxpayers more. And it's these industry voices which may force a rethink. What do you think?
Well, I'm completely sceptical about stuff like this for a number of reasons. Probably the most important one being the first one. it's the Daily Mail.
As I said
Right.
at the start.
Yeah. Never knowingly sort of said anything that might be possibly supportive of the Labour Party. So I think got to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
And I was very skeptical when I read it and when I heard it. I mean, a senior industry source saying, "Oh, you know, you need the private sector because otherwise costs get out of control and revenues go down." Sorry, where have you been the last 4 years? I mean, which world are you living in, right? And that sounded to me like a very sort of vested interest position, right? And I even to the point where I just wonder whether the whole thing was a bit of a placed piece, really.
Frequently are. But it's the first time I've heard it said. Anyway.
Well, it's the first time, arguably, that sources close to people in the Labour Party sort of letting it kind of be known that there might be an issue. I don't know. I'm struggling to understand, and this is a words I never thought I'd hear myself say. I'm struggling to understand where these extra costs come from, because if you just let the contracts expire, is there really an extra cost? Now, there will be a cost of employing people to manage them, but you've got that cost now. You avoid the 2% management fee that you've got for the National Rail contracts. So where's the extra cost? Now, I accept the argument that that the private sector may be long-term more effective controllers of costs and growers of revenue. Others would disagree with that, but let's just put that to one side. But I can't quite see where the extra costs come, because the one thing we do know is that we've got to grow the railway, and if we don't, and the growing the railway is really the prerequisite for that is a boring, safe, predictable, reliable railway, and that's not really a public-private thing. That's just a railway thing. So where are these extra costs coming from of Labour's policy? I am struggling a bit.
I know what you mean, and it's difficult to articulate. I am convinced it would cost more. Just indulge me while I stream of consciousness, and we'll see where we end up.
Shall I put the kettle on?
Yeah. Or grab the whiskey bottle or whatever. Okay, let's assume that we let these contracts expire, and one by one, the train operating companies are all is gathered in. Who is actually going to run the railway in that respect? It's probably not going to be Network Rail. Is it going to be, Robin Gisby's operator of last resort? Are we going to stick them in with South Eastern, LNER, and Northern? Government has got an appalling reputation, and this is not a political point, it's across the board. Governments have got a terrible reputation for not really being able to manage stuff in the real world and maintain costs while doing it. And I don't want to open the floodgates, but look at the health service. I've had a lot of contact with it over the last few years, one way or the other, with my dad before he died. And it's despair at there's a general lack of real engagement and energy and sharpness, which the private sector does bring on behalf of you and me as taxpayers. And I'll take some convinced that if you lump it all together into some sort of BR board, or we end up with Gisby Rail or OLR, that costs won't just creep up because there's nobody there bearing down on it the whole time in the way the talks do now. Full stop. Discuss, as the A-level questions used to say.
Okay. I mean, I can't believe that I'm about to put a counter argument to that. I mean, me.
Really?
Blimey. Yeah. Well, it is just a potential counter argument. I mean, when the SRA took over Connex, Southeastern, it had a difficult birth. I mean, it was quite painful to begin with, but, it ended up being okay. I think LNER have shown that actually when you put the right people in charge, people kind of trump all, really.
They do.
And, David has done a fantastic job there.
Here.
ScotRail has got its issues, and it's got more meddling from the Scottish government than perhaps is good for it. But nonetheless, Alex, with a very good stakeholder lead in Bill Reeves, are running a decent operation. It's not perfect. They wouldn't claim it's perfect. They would say there's more to do. So I'm not sure. All right, I'm not sure it's very much it's the private sector argument of the day, which is, oh, you need us, to keep control of costs and grow revenues. And I would say, well, yeah, well, maybe that's where we're going to get back to in the future. But right now, what we need is a really boring, reliable,
Yes,
safe, obviously gripped railway. And I'm not sure that's a public-private thing. I think it's a railway professional thing. And it may be that that's what we need for the next 5 years. But it still comes back to, where's the extra cost coming from, other than the cost and revenue point?
I mean, you're right about ScotRail's got Alex, I'd say, for now. And any system, as we know, is moving on. And any system that works well, that relies on the people, is not a good one. Because if the people move, then things can all come unravelled. And I'm just not convinced. I say it's a very difficult one to articulate. But I just feel as though the cost would creep up quite rapidly.
Well, I don't know. I don't think it's a given. I think public and private sector organisations over the years have often been defined by the quality of the people that lead them.
Indeed, that's what I've just said that. All right, answer me this one then. We've got LNER as part of Gisby Rail, doing a brilliant job under David and his team. We've always said that. It don't get everything right, as we know, but, if you don't fall off from time to time, you're not pedalling hard enough, are you? So LNER, tick, under David. Southeastern, Steve White. So is there not an argument there? Just put them all into OLR and let that do it, because if you've got the right people involved, they'll run themselves, so to speak.
Well, possibly. I mean, that might be the answer. I'm not sure. I mean, the current operator of last resort organisation, I think, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the DFT.
It is.
And in our GBR world, we know that stuff is planned to move over to GBR. I mean, maybe Tupi applies again. Maybe Robin's about to.
And the Secretary of State can direct from time to time, as you know.
Indeed. So I think somebody somewhere does need to sit back and say, right, it does. What we've got today for operator of last resort probably is not what we need for the future in a much more structured world where everything's coming into GBR. But there will be lessons and there will be models, yes. But I think you probably need a slightly different approach. But that's one of the challenges for the next 12 months, I guess. Yeah.
Just one last comment before the quiz then. Is that we need to know what's going on. Like you say, we don't know how it's going to run. We don't know what the Labour's public ownership thing would mean. And across the board, and I know your argument about this is where we do disagree. It's a wholly rational political argument to say nothing until close. But, you can't go on like that forever. We need to know what we're voting for and what the thing is. I heard, across the piece in a political discussion the other day that everybody's just keeping the powder dry, call it what you will, but we deserve better. I think that treats us with contempt. We're not idiots.
I think the voters have been told what it's going to be, which is a publicly accountable, publicly owned railway. And I think most people will go, great, because the one we've got at the moment is crap.
But it is publicly owned and it is publicly accountable. The network is publicly owned. The passenger services, apart from open access services, are publicly owned and they're accountable to the DFTs, which is public.
I just think the people who want to know more are people like us who want to understand how it would work, whereas most voters possibly have been given the direction of travel, which is sufficient for now. I might be wrong.
Yeah, but that's because they think that LNER owns their bit of the railway, like they used to think that Virgin own the railway, and they don't. That's because the starting point is not an accurate understanding of the situation we're in. Anyway, I can see you getting fed up, so we'll move on to the quiz.
I'm not getting fed up at all. I think this is going to be.
I saw that look in your eyes, Bowker. At least have the
talking about?
Human decency to own your own boredom when I can see it on screen.
All right, touche. But I'll tell you what. When we do find out what the detail is, I promise that we can yabber on about it for as long as you want to.
Good. You've spent too long in public service and government and what have you, and you've acquired a bit of Sir Humphrey about you.
Wow. Well, I'm definitely going to move it onto the quiz now. You've acquired a bit of the Sir Humphrey about where you could say that. I couldn't possibly comment. Right. Okay.
Well,
right.
there you go. I rest my case.
Outrageous. Right. Okay. The quiz.
Here we go.
Well, last week's question was good, wasn't it? I thought it was a really good one.
Yeah.
Which was, where in the UK is there an example of a locomotive going sideways as part of a regular passenger service? There were some good answers. There were some people who picked examples that I think have happened in the past. But the winner was Richard Hill, 1978, on YouTube, who correctly said Corris station uses a traverser. It's on the Ryford Corris Railway, and it opened for use in 2022. And we'll put a link on our website, actually, in our additional resources. It's worth a look. It's fantastic. I mean, it's a brilliant way of maximising operational flexibility from the minimum amount of space, and the locomotive genuinely goes sideways.
And that's it, isn't it? It uses much less space than a traditional crossover. And every run round of every train in routine service, the locomotive goes sideways to get to the other end of the train. Yeah. Maybe for those watching on YouTube, we could flash up at least a screen grab, which would encourage people to go and follow the link. So there's
we will do just that.
I've landed you with a job, Richard, which you were.
Yeah, that's just made the edit a bit harder than it needed to be. But anyway, okay. Anyway, so thanks for that, Nigel. So,
you're very welcome, Richard.
Yeah. You're just getting your own back, I know.
Yeah.
Now, this week's question, and you do have to listen to the question carefully. Remember, we always say to our kids, read the exam question. Right? Anyway,
answer the question on the paper.
Yeah, here it is. Which class of British rail locomotives only had a single member of the class? So, which class of British rail locomotives only had a single member of the class? If you think you know, let us know via YouTube or Twitter or email or whatever. And the first correct answer wins.
Is that is that including steam or diesel or electric or anything or what?
All the information you need is in the question.
Okay.
Said Sir Humphrey.
It was a great series, wasn't it?
It was absolutely superb.
I absolutely loved it. You know, brilliantly scripted, brilliant conceived, brilliantly acted. That wonderful triumvirate of things you need to be.
Absolutely.
Right. On to the good news. A new £17.5 million rail terminal has opened at the port of Southampton. Isn't that good news?
It is very good news.
Yeah, the new Solent rail terminal took 18 months to complete and was officially opened by Rail Minister Hugh Merriman. An 18-acre facility, it's expanded the rail terminal and created a first for the port by broadening the services offered to include container handling, storage, maintenance and repair, all on site. Track layout has been redesigned to enable simultaneous arrivals and departures by rail, and the rail loading pad has been extended by 130 metres. Wonderful to hear. The idea is to strengthen Southampton's position as the UK's #1 gateway for deep-sea trade. So well done to the freight industry, and let's continue to support them. As an aside, Richard, isn't it interesting that you can get a rail terminal like this for about £6 million less than a plain 2-platform station with a bus shelter?
Yeah, I know. I've still not heard from anybody about Haxby Station, but I live in hope. But that is a very interesting piece of analysis. That's a very interesting comparison, yeah.
Well, there you go. Right, that's all we've got time for this week, and that's the first time I've caught Richard being bored with what I was saying on air in such a visible fashion, and I'm not going to forget it. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe, whatever. And more importantly, join us again next week to see on what subject I can bore Richard. For now, all the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.